Thank you very much, Arya. You have been so generous with me on Saturday, and you are again reiterating your generosity here in this introduction. Now, most of you here in the public, in the audience, surely know that I am not an Israel scholar. Hence, what follows here can be considered as the reflections of a layman, not the scientific paper of an academic. Yet having dedicated, as Arya mentioned, more than 20 years to the study of Mediterranean fascism, I cannot but be respectful of the craft of the historian. I trust, however, that Clio does allow a degree of freedom outside the rigid discipline of footnotes and references. Since my early days as a scholar, while struggling with files of documents in dusty archives in an attempt to break the code of this ever-elusive, yet so central question of causality in historical research, I developed this dream of being allowed one day to produce a history book without footnotes. I eventually wrote such a book, and OUP was even generous or maybe foolish enough to publish it. You, the scholars assembled here, are not stepping into a void when you opted for Israel as an academic and intellectual preoccupation, not only because of the groundbreaking work already done by the founding fathers of Israel studies, but also because no such a small country like the Jewish state has elicited in modern times so much interest, stirred up so many passions, and created such an extraordinary degree of controversy like Israel. Israel might suffer from too small a geography, but it has more history and memory per square mile than any other country in the planet. These, the non-tangible categories of Israel's existence, namely memory, history, and the struggle over millenarian certificates of ownership, is what makes our small corner of the world so disproportionately central in the business and the concern of the family of nations. It is not the humble dimensions of our real estate that attract the world's attention. It is the intangible categories of our existence as a nation that makes us so particularly interesting for the world. Historically, Jewish experience in international relations was not particularly edifying. An independent Jewish state existed for only short periods out of our millenarian history, and it twice committed political suicide. The reason was always the same: the blunder of ignoring political realities and challenging the world powers that governed the international system of the time. David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the modern state of Israel, never tired of alerting his generation of never again conducting a foreign policy that is not sustained by the alliance with a superpower. The interactive nature of an international system is inherently alien to Judaism. Ours is an ethnocentric view of the Jewish people versus the nations of the world. But ethnocentrism is bound to distort a people's relations with the rest of the world. Hence, Martin Buber's advice: our task, he said, is not just to assert ourselves into the world, but to assert the world into ourselves. Israel's tendency of facing the world, an amorphous and almost meta-historical figure with whom the Jews have a dispute pending that cannot be resolved through the traditional tools of international relations, was reasserted through the role of the Holocaust as the constituent myth of the Zionist Israeli meta-narrative. Israel's ideology of power was drawn from the depth of Jewish experience and from the eternal, unforgivable hostility of a Gentile world. It was through Zionism as an essentially secular nationalist movement that the Jews returned to political action and developed the necessary diplomatic tools. Indeed, early Zionism was definitely blessed with a sense of pragmatism and diplomatic savoir-faire. This was not to be always the hallmark of the State of Israel in later years. By this, I by no means wish to imply that Israeli diplomacy was devoid of achievements. In the heroic days of Israeli diplomacy, it was an admired brand name in Africa and Latin America and in Europe. Even when they all join now in the condemnation of Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, they still embrace to this very day the nostalgia for a pioneering Israel and its extraordinary achievements in agriculture and technology. Israel's association agreements with the European Union are also major exploits of Israeli diplomacy. Admittedly, however, they are under constant threat, for their very existence was in the first place due to breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli peace process. Zionism was essentially a Western-orientated strategy that reflected a cultural alienation from the Arab East. It was a cultural choice as much as a strategic inevitability. David Ben-Gurion was candid enough in his letter to the Arab nationalist George Antonius, the author of the Arab Awakening. He wrote, "We want to return to the East only in the geographic sense, for our objective is to create here a European culture." Israel is, of course, far ahead of any Middle Eastern country when it comes to its Western profile as an economy, a society, and a democratic polity. But it is also the case that Israel's complex, multifaceted social structure of these days is not easily conducive to an accommodation with the international community. There is, of course, a powerful brand of, say, Tel Aviv-style Israeliness that embraces the culture of secularism, modernity, and normalcy. This is an Israel that aspires to be part and parcel of the global village, not anymore an isolated Jewish village, as metaphorical Jerusalem would have liked it. The Israel of Jerusalem is embedded in the dire lessons of Jewish history. It is a magnet for the fears and complexes of a wide rainbow alignment of ethnic minorities, all yearning for Jewish roots. Jerusalem is the epitome of a deep-rooted fear of the Arabs and an uncompromising distrust of the Goyim and their international community. Grand territorial designs were always on the agenda of the Zionist movement, but in the early years they were tempered by a sober acknowledgement of the limits of power. It is because of the preponderance of the military way that the extraordinary achievements of diplomatic Zionism were relegated to a marginal corner in the Israelis' collective memory. But this should not be allowed to overshadow the extraordinary achievements of diplomatic Zionism. A witness in 1941-42 to one such brilliant moment in Zionist diplomacy, Sir Isaiah Berlin, then a diplomat at the British Embassy in the US, admitted in his 1972 Jerusalem lecture, Zionist Politics in Wartime Washington, his own pro-Weizmann mistaken view that the Jews would obtain a state in Palestine with British help or not obtain one at all. Ben-Gurion's capacity to see the inevitable collapse of the British orientation and his ability to shift right in time the focus of Zionist diplomacy from Britain to the US was a masterly exercise in strategic intuition and diplomatic skill. Characteristically honest, Isaiah Berlin admitted his own and Weizmann's misreading of the forces at play. Isaiah Berlin did not suffer from an excess of respect for what he defined as the ghettoish mentality of the diaspora Jews, and he dreaded, as he wrote to Felix Frankfurter in 1934, of the emergence of a Jewish state of talit sellers, hotel keepers, and souvenir vendors. But Berlin did live long enough to see that the new man of the Zionist revolution posed no less of a challenge to the state of Israel's relations with the world community. The founding fathers, all diaspora Jews, were cautious and diplomatic precisely because they represented the traditional Jewish fear. Indeed, one of the most fascinating moments in the history of Israel's oscillation between activism and diplomatic prudence took place on the eve of the 1967 war. What in reality tore apart the Israeli system in its response to the rapidly evolving crisis was a deep cultural and political cleavage between the young Israeli-born generals, all self-confident, proud of the formidable military machine under their command, and spiteful of the Galutic and submissive ways of the older generation on the one hand, and the diaspora-born politicians on the other. It is very difficult to create a state, but very easy to lose it. Such was the response of Minister of Finance Pinchas Sapir to the general's impassioned call for war. "I am prepared to fight, but not to commit suicide," was the reaction of Chaim Moshe Shapira, the leader of the National Religious Party. The radical transformation of this party from a conservative position before the war to the politics of Messianism as the party of the settlers in Judea and Samaria after the war tells a great part of the story about the meaning of the Six-Day War in the life and the politics of Israel. 1967 is a major watershed in the evolution of Israel's self-image and its relation with the world. History knows, of course, of many cases where one particular year opens an entirely new chapter in the annals of a country, a region, and sometimes the entire world. Think of the world before and after 9/11, or think of the meaning of 1979, the year that the Chinese started their economic reforms, the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, the visit of Pope John Paul to Poland, the coming of Margaret Thatcher to power, and the Iranian Revolution. After these two last events, two political revolutions, nothing would be the same for the twin forces of market and religion that were discounted for so long. They now came back with a vengeance. God, particularly God, was now back. Nobody would deny on a different, albeit not particularly minor scale, that 1967 was the kind of annus mirabilis for Israel and the Middle East. Those 6 days of June 67 reshaped the deployment of the superpowers in the region, created the conditions for an eventual dismantling of Soviet presence in the Middle East, shifted Israel's alliances from Europe to the United States, turned Europe into the major critic of Israel's occupation practices, and put the Jewish state in the dock of the tribunal of public opinion, and gave new forms and opened new avenues for the solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. If 1979 was the year God came back in Iran, Poland, and beyond, 1967 anticipated the return of the Almighty to politics at the hand of a Jewish brand of messianic political theology. This political theology of settlers and their rabbinical mentors that the late Uriel Tal did so much to unravel in his studies continues to these days to define the rationale behind the vilification of Israel throughout the international community. There is a mistaken convention that some of the founding fathers were indifferent to what the world would think of what are Israel's policies. Everybody remembers Ben-Gurion's alleged words about shmum. It does not matter what the Gentiles would say. What matters is what the Jews would do. Ben-Gurion was truly anything but indifferent to the reactions of the UN, the superpowers, and international opinion. In a speech at the Knesset on 2nd August 1949, introducing the armistice agreements, he said, "We were always very careful not to use the IDF lightly or without due consideration to the consequences. This is because we never thought that world opinion does not matter, nor is our way that of disregarding the UN and public opinion." Ben-Gurion was not indifferent to world opinion, without which he claimed Israel cannot have the security it needed. In a speech at the Knesset in October 1960, he said, "Without the sympathy of the world, our army alone would not be able to give security to Israel." Ben-Gurion also understood that in foreign affairs, our actions need to be focused on reasonable objectives. They need to be instrumental, not expressive. They should not be addressed at causing us satisfaction or self-glorification. It was out of a sense of realism that he made a far-reaching strategic decision in the 1950s to link Israel with the Western bloc of nations, to seek an alliance with one or more Western superpowers, or even join NATO. Notwithstanding Israel's proven capacity to face the Arabs on the battlefield, the old man was throughout haunted by fears of annihilation and was always doubtful as to the capacity of a small Jewish state to survive in a hostile Arab neighborhood. It was not only through superior military capabilities that Zionism prevailed in the struggle for statehood. Its victory depended no less on its sense of realism. To illustrate this particular point, allow me a leap into an event I was witness to in January 2001. I will never be able to erase from my memory my feelings at the end of our last-ditch attempt to reach a settlement with the Palestinians at Taba. Here, I wrote in my diary, an outline of a reasonable settlement is lying on the table. One would have to be blind not to understand that these were also the last days of the Israeli left in power, maybe for long years to come. This I wrote in my diary. The political profile of an Israeli team, I insist the political profile, not the talent or anything else, of a team consisting of Yossi Sarid, Yossi Beilin, Amnon Shachar, and if I may myself, as the head of the Israeli team, might not be repeated, politically speaking, in years to come. In other words, if an agreement was not to be reached then, there will be no agreement at all, and both Israelis and Palestinians would be thrown into a wilderness of blood, despair, and economic decline. Nevertheless, I did not succeed in discerning any sense of urgency or missed opportunity among my Palestinian interlocutors. Zionism, admittedly, principally up to 1948, would have never functioned this way against what is always and inevitably an imperfect settlement. Zionism always functioned with its back against the wall, which is why it was always blessed with the capacity for pragmatic decision-making. There are two essential reasons that can explain the pragmatic wisdom of Zionism at decisional crossroads. One is the fact that in contrast to the anti-Semitic cliché about Jewish power, Zionism was always the national movement of a weak Jewish people, decimated by persecution and genocide. The Palestinians, the presumably weak side of the conflict, never acted out of lack of choice like Zionism. Until 1948, the Zionists certainly excelled in their capacity to mobilize international support and market their case. The Palestinians, however, stumbled on every roadblock, avoided no mistake, and displayed no particular creativity in the field of diplomacy and public relations. After the Six-Day War, however, the balance of forces in the war on public opinion clearly changed. Rarely, if ever, is history familiar with a similar case of a disparity between the high degree of international support enjoyed by a national movement and the poor results of such a support. In fact, after the Six-Day War, one could say that the Palestinians almost suffered from an excess of international support. The international pampering of the national Palestinian movement is unparalleled in modern history. As I shall comment later, the anti-Israel bias in Western opinion has far deeper roots than just the consequences of the Six-Day War. But we should not delude ourselves into assuming that the international support for the Palestinians is nothing more than a politically correct form of anti-Semitism. We need not forget that the Jewish case for statehood was significantly enhanced by the Jewish catastrophe. No other state in modern history was born, like Israel, with such a degree of international sympathy and guilt feelings. Much of the sympathy of world opinion with the plight of the Palestinians has to do not only with the erosion of the memory about the Jewish catastrophe throughout the West, but also with the growing acknowledgement that the Palestinians have their own catastrophe for which they also deserve to be compensated. The second difference between Zionism and the Palestinian movement refers to the ethos. Zionism was a social revolution, an attempt to change the patterns of existence of the Jewish people, no less than it was a journey into the soil of the land of Israel. Though admittedly never really abandoning wider territorial dreams, it would have never occurred to Ben-Gurion to delay the establishment of the Jewish state because he would not have access to the Western Wall or to the Temple Mount. The positive ethos of building a new society was supposed to compensate for the poverty of the territorial solution. Yet, that the Palestinians failed their people at vital crossroads cannot serve as a consolation for Israel's own blunders. Seen in perspective, Israel's 67 lightning victory recalls Hegel's dictum about the impotence of the winners. This simple lesson of history that Yaakov Talmon tried to share with Menachem Begin in his 1981 open letter from the historian Yaakov Talmon to the historian Menachem Begin was elaborated as an intellectual challenge to the messianic rights quest for one major eschatological event that would radically and once and for all change the situation in favor of Israel. The ideological settlers in Judea and Samaria like to defend their messianic mission on the ground that also Zionism was an unrealistic dream that miraculously came true. But this was not the case. There was nothing miraculous or providential about Zionism's exploits. Zionism materialized because the historical conditions and the political circumstances favored it, and because Zionist diplomacy wisely navigated through the waters of international relations. We should not conclude from this that we can set to ourselves far-reaching, utterly unrealistic objectives. Realism defines the limits of what is possible. Not every fantasy is a vision. The ethos of important segments in Israel's polity lies in their insistence to blur this vital distinction. Fatalism as to the chances of peace is a useless advisor in international relations. History teaches us that political positions are not eternal. Ask the sons of the founding fathers of the Israeli right, Tzipi Livni, Ehud Olmert, and who knows, maybe even Bibi Netanyahu, if this sentence is so far-fetched. Positions are always susceptible to change. There are indeed protracted conflicts, but statesmen cannot accept that political positions are eternal. It is not true that concessions to the Arabs are useless, because they will always be hostile and nothing will distract them from the objective of destroying us. They might not accept, in fact, they will never accept, the moral justice of Zionism. But as Egypt did in its peace with Israel, and as the Arab Peace Initiative indicates, they might consider accepting the political as opposed to the moral legitimacy of a Jewish state. Israel's quest for security in a hostile Middle East is understood by the international community. That neither in 1948 nor in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war was Israel subjected to irresistible international pressure to relinquish its territorial gains was due to the perception of its victory being the result of a legitimate war of self-defense. Such was clearly not the case in 1956. But the international acquiescence to the situation created by Israel's victory in 1967 was to be extremely short-lived, when the war of salvation and survival turned into a war of conquest, occupation, and settlement. The international community recalled, and Israel went on the defensive. She remains there ever since. Israel's singular paradox of an intimidating regional superpower that is at the same time genuinely possessed by a sense of almost apocalyptic vulnerability is a contradiction in terms that the Israelis are fully reconciled with, but which the world has never been truly able or willing to comprehend. Seen from the perspective of the more than a century-old conflict, and from that of the politics of war and the diplomacy of all or nothing that prevailed for so many years in the Arab-Israeli dispute, Zionism can claim that it has prevailed against all odds. The major victory of Zionism that started in the Arab perception and in that of many beyond the Arab world as a foreign colonial intrusion is that it succeeded in forcing its enemies to come to terms with it, assume its existence, and even contemplate peace with Israel. Israel even managed to force the entire Arab world, and with it the international community as well, to accept the legitimacy of the 1948 borders, even though these went far beyond the borders that were approved for the Jewish state in 1947. If Israel accepts trimming its post-1967 territorial ambitions and assumes that the territorial phase of Zionism has come to its end, Zionism victory can still be finally sealed. Israel's international dilemma is not confined only to the corridors of power in world capitals. The case for Israel, more than that of any other country in the planet, is frequently decided in the International Tribunal of Public Opinion. In that tribunal, a BBC World Survey, I don't know how reliable it was, but seemingly not entirely far-fetched, found recently that Israel ranks as the fourth most hated country in the world after North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran. Germany, by the way, was chosen as the most liked nation in the world for those who say that things cannot change. That this is so can be explained in great part by the devastating effects of Israel's annexationist policies in the occupied Palestinian lands. But we should not delude ourselves into believing that a political solution of the Palestinian problem would offer an immediate panacea to Israel's dilemma with the world. Our dispute with Arabs and Muslims might one day be solved. The built-in tension in the Jews' love-hatred affair with the Christian West goes beyond politics and territory. This has to do with the uniqueness of the Jewish-Israeli phenomenon as a historical anomaly. The Jewish people, also its state, is radically singular, for it embodies a unique junction of religion, peoplehood, territory, and culture. Nor is the mass return of Jews to their historical homeland after long centuries of absence an easily digestible phenomenon, particularly given the price that was paid by the Arab population that dwelled the land for centuries. To the Palestinians and their friends in the West, Israel is a state that was born in sin, and the Palestinians is an unpardonable tragedy of cosmic dimensions. Israel's sins are moreover magnified, given that this anomalous phenomenon, the state of Israel, is the first and so far the only predominantly Western people whose birth and formative years as a nation were accompanied and suffered by a near total exposure to the modern mass media. For a story in today's media-dominated world to have the extraordinary impact that the Palestinian tragedy has, it needs to be perceived as part of a far bigger story that is central to the worldview of the Western man, an inextricable part of his heritage. In this case, the bigger story is the Bible, and also the unique role that the Jewish question played in the history of Christendom. It is not the Palestinian tragedy as such that attracts world attention. It is the role and the guilt of the Jews that makes it so central in the international discourse. If only the dimension of human tragedies would have been the reason for the mobilization of the world's attention, we would have seen the streets of Western capitals overflowed by daily demonstrations over the destruction of Chechnya, the suppression of the people of Tibet, the mass killing in Syria, where in 2 years of conflict, more people have been slaughtered than during 65 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict. By depicting Israel's harsh treatment of the Palestinians as another form of genocide, and by consistently putting Israel in the dock of international opinion, the West exonerates itself from its guilt complex towards the Jews. But the truth is that Zionism was put in the dock by its detractors years before the occupation acquired the truly reproachable practices of recent years. 30 years after the Holocaust, a UN resolution equating Zionism with racism was passed. In 1975, one should recall, there were hardly any settlements in the territories, and the Palestine Liberation Organization had not yet endorsed the two-state solution. The now fashionable, I think, nonsense about a one-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute still draws its rationale from the old topic that religion is not a proper basis for statehood, as if the European states were not historically born as Christian republics, and as if the Arab states surrounding Israel are a monument to religious diversity. Israel's political and moral crisis is a predicament that affected most Western nations in the modern era. It responds to a conflict that is solvable between competing nationalisms. Europe, which too frequently looks at us with the air of sanctimonious finger-wagger, knows from experience how bitter can such conflicts become? It took Europe many religious wars, 2 world wars, and more than 1 genocide to solve its endemic disputes over borders and nationalism. And its record in colonialism has written monstrous pages in human history. And this is exactly the crux of the matter. The intriguing attitude that turns what should be the reproachable policies of a government into the trigger for a discourse whose underlying meaning is the negation of the right of existence of a state and now of the entire Zionist idea. There is also this suspicious frivolity with which Western NGOs rush to apply to Israel's war practices all the metaphors of the Shoah. And so Jenin becomes a metaphor for Stalingrad, and according to the late Nobel laureate Saramago, no less than Auschwitz. This looks to me as a mental mechanism through which the European subconscious gets rid of its guilt complex with regard to the Jewish question by applying to the Jews all the metaphors of the Holocaust. Sometimes, even those of us who consider themselves to be on the left side of the divide, we believe that the vilification of Israel has long superseded what may be defined as legitimate criticism, for it sometimes looks as if it has turned into an international bacchanalia of character assassination. The old continent suffers from 2 guilt complexes that have much to do with Israel: the colonial and the Jewish complex. The Arab Israeli, and more specifically the Palestinian tragedy, is directly affected by this European dilemma. As a political trend, Zionism was perhaps more European than Jewish. It was born as an integral part of the final wave of liberal European nationalism. The German Zionist leader Kurt Blumenfeld defined Zionism as Europe's gift to the Jews. But the State of Israel emerged out of a dramatic crisis of the European conscience. For the Europeans, it was supposed to be a compensation for the sins committed against the Jewish people. However, the price that was paid by the Palestinians touched another neuralgic center in the European mind. As Europe got entangled in this seemingly insoluble conundrum, Israeli diplomacy started to dismiss it as an ineffective external power, sometimes trying to compensate for its lack of political effectiveness with an unbearably righteous and moralistic discourse. Where I personally could witness with dismay Europe's betrayal was in the early days of the Second Intifada. For long months, we, the Barak government, had been the darlings of Europe, for we negotiated peace by coming close to the outer limits of our capacity for compromise. We touched and broke all the taboos of our collective existence. We accepted the division of Jerusalem. We committed ourselves to the practical withdrawal from the territories and to the creation of a fully viable Palestinian state, not in Camp David, through the Clinton peace parameters. And we spoke of evacuating hundreds of settlements for the benefits of returning Palestinian refugees. In sum, we came as close as possible to breaking the very genetic code of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Europe applauded us. However, the moment the Intifada started, the onus was almost exclusively put upon us. This was Europe's moment of truth, and it failed to meet it. Instead of using its extraordinary economic, political, and mainly moral leverage on the Palestinians, Europe focused its critique on the supposedly excessive force that Israel was using in its defense. However, more importantly, the Europeans were simply not willing to see a truth that became common knowledge later on, as indeed no other than a Palestinian brilliant scholar, Yazid Sayegh, put it in his essay, Arafat, Anatomy of a Revolt, that is that Arafat preempted a possible moment of decision. Arafat was an extremely complicated individual. To this very day, with all sincerity, I cannot say if he wanted or if he did not want a peace deal. By this, I'm not saying that he did not want. He was an enigmatic personality. Of Arafat, one could say what Lloyd George said of De Valera, the Irish leader. He said about, Lloyd George said about De Valera that negotiating with him is like picking mercury with a fork. So you always are left with empty-handed. Now, the essayist Mario Andrea Rigoni addressed in his tribute to America Europe's dilemma in the following terms, and I think it concerns us. He wrote the following: Europe is an old lady who, after she had allowed herself all sorts of liberties, after having committed many mistakes and a great number of horrors, would like, once she has reached the age of society, fatigue and weakness, to see the world adapt itself to her needs for moderation, equity, and peace. She not only does not forgive America for having fished her out of the center of the stage, but in her impudence, she also pretends to make America responsible for the poisoned heritage she herself had bequeathed from Vietnam to the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is indeed this interesting triangle of Europe, Israel, America. At a time when Europeans try to move beyond power politics, America and Israel remain, in the eyes of the Europeans, as anarchic powers, almost exclusively relying on Machtpolitik rather than on international rules and laws. Americans and Israelis share an obsession for perfect and total security. The Europeans' way requires coexisting with evil and contemporizing with it rather than trying to eliminate it altogether. This was the essence of their policy of appeasement towards Hitler and, mutatis mutandis, their attitude to Saddam Hussein. Yet an exclusive Pax Americana in the Middle East might not work either, if only because of America's own exhaustion as an imperial power. Now, Washington's strategic focus seems to be shifting to the East. In the last 25 years, America collected only failures in its peace diplomacy in the region, engaged in wars particularly expensive in blood and treasure, and lost the trust of many of the peoples in the region, among other reasons because of its staunch support for the Jewish state. Now, with the new technology of shale gas, the US will shortly leave well without even one drop of Middle Eastern oil. Nor is President Obama's recent, truly revolutionary speech, where he practically declared the end to George W. Bush's war on terror, exactly good news to an Israeli government that prefers an America that is at war with the Arab and Muslim world to one that goes back to the task of healing the rift with it and asks Israel to assume its share in the deal, namely the creation of a Palestinian state along the 1967 lines. Obama's implicit message to Israel here is actually much more far-reaching. He not only says that the US does no longer see a link between Gaza and the jihadist terrorism it had been fighting against, he also extricates America from its identification with Israel as the two anarchic powers almost exclusively relying on Machtpolitik rather than on international rules and laws. This is an attempt to disengage the US from the philosophy of self-enforced rules of behavior, from the image of a selfish nation state bent on breaking all the international rules of engagement in the name of sacred national egoism. It is one thing for Israel to be at such a corner together with the US, it is totally another to remain there alone. Yet, however exhausted, the European idea can still be relevant to the vital quest for an architecture of peace, stability, and cooperation in the Middle East. Europe's role in the multilateral peace track during the 90s was the expression of a commendable vocation for a novel and rich concept of security that continues to be vital for the Middle East as well. There are many lessons Europe can teach us, even a Europe that is in crisis. The EU is not the proof of the decay of the nation state. It teaches us that nationalism, if respected, can become a responsible force and can be made into a benign basis for broader international cooperation. The two-state solution has its flaws and difficulties, but we have a message to convey to our own society. All other alternatives might be worse and might put in jeopardy the entire Zionist project. Israel's existence as a nation and as a state derives from the critical lessons of Jewish millenarian history. And I think that the elites in Israel today have to confront the world around them, not only with the defensive tools that we have developed or acquired over the years. I am by no means that naive to believe that force is unnecessary, especially given the neighborhood where Israel lives today. But from the US experience in Iraq, we learned that force without legitimacy can eventually backlash. What is required for Israel is to strive to be on the right side of international legitimacy. I was discussing with a friend before coming into the room about the pessimistic attitude of one of my colleagues when it comes to the future of the peace process. I told him, he might have been surprised by my answer, that I was always very pessimistic. But I was pessimistic in the sense that I do not believe in a celestial peace between Israelis and Arabs, and I never subscribed to Shimon Peres' idea about a new Middle East. To me, the meaning of the peace process is for Israel to have legitimate, internationally legitimate, recognized borders. When Theodor Herzl spoke about a Jewish state, he added, "B'mishpat ha'amim," that is, one that is based on the law of the nations. This will give us a pillar of security that we have discarded for so many years now. We are a nation of survivors that now faces a momentous test of ideas and leadership. It is up to our leaders to inculcate into us the notion that we have not survived all the horrors of extermination only to entrench ourselves behind the walls of our own convictions and remain there righteous and immobile. Leadership has a challenge today. The masses will follow. All the surveys and the polls that we know speak about the consent of most of Israelis and Palestinians on the notion of a two-state solution. But it is a passive support. It is up to the leaders to go back to the vision that was the driving force of Zionism in its early days. I truly believe that not all is lost. Israel has still much to say to the international community, and if it goes to internationally recognized borders, it will have peace with the world, with the only caveat that history and memory between us and many nations in the world will still remain as a bone of contention between us and them, but at least this is an intellectual or even political challenge, one that does not kill people. Thank you very much.